Welcome to Groundwater Rising. This podcast is all about flooding, with a focus on the forgotten source of flooding, groundwater flooding. Groundwater flooding is the least understood, least monitored, and least reported on. It is often left out of the conversation, so we're a podcast dedicated to changing that. I'm Katie Hargrave-Smith from Project Groundwater, and in this podcast, I will be speaking to community members from around the UK who have to deal with groundwater flooding, and industry experts trying to help them. Together, we will uncover the latest research, innovation, and strategies from the water sector, academia, and beyond. Today, we're turning our attention to an often overlooked but vital part of flood risk planning, legacy. Flood risk is frequently managed through projects ranging from small local interventions to large-scale national initiatives. While project planning rightly emphasises feasibility and affordability, there's a third equally critical dimension that doesn't always get the attention it deserves: legacy. Will the project create lasting value? Will it remain effective not just today, but 10, 15, even 50 years from now? And perhaps most importantly, has it been designed to integrate with existing systems, communities, and landscapes so that it will endure well beyond the official end of the project? I'm excited to chat with Karen Fisher and Kat Edwards about the importance of planning for legacy, including when and how to tackle it. Karen Fisher is a Senior Associate Director at Jacobs. Karen has run her own consultancy to support in restoring rivers, where she worked with agencies such as the Wildlife Trusts and the Environment Agency, and has also worked in local authorities, giving her a well-rounded view of flood risk management. Kat Edwards is a co-founder from AxiaOrigin with a background in the water industry. Kat has worked with Project Groundwater since 2023, leading the evaluation, learning, and innovation workstream. Kat and Karen, thank you so much for joining me today.
Hello.
Good to be with you.
So, to set this up, I think we need to start with a very key question of what is legacy? Karen, can I come to you first?
I think of legacy as long-lasting impact of something, not only what is being delivered on a project and doing what you say, but also perhaps some of those more intangible things that we might not think of as deliverables. How does this impact people, both the communities that we're working in, the other partners that we're working with, other local authorities, and also the wider professionals? I don't want to sort of restrict it though, because I think it can be many, many different things.
I really liked how you described that, Karen. And I remember us thinking when we did the workshop, when we explored those different legacy examples, like Keep Britain Tidy, the Eden project, and we kind of explored the more intangible elements of it and kind of the feeling that people have with some of those legacy projects. So I think for me, there's obviously technical deliverables that we hope will stand the test of time, but also I think the intangible things of how people feel they've been maybe even looked after from a groundwater flood point of view. So what is the feeling they get when they hear Project Groundwater once project is officially closed, I think is something that is important to think about as well.
Do you mind speaking more about some of those examples that you mentioned, why you think they're a good example of legacy?
We shared examples, not to say if they were good or bad, but to prompt discussion and inspiration. And most examples had some yin and yang to them. One of the examples that come to mind was the Olympics in London 2012, and how the kind of whole point of it was to create a legacy for sport in England and make sure that people who didn't have access to sport would have that in the future. Everyone agreed that, the Olympics were amazing. It was nice to have them on our home turf. Infrastructure that's been left is good, but actually, is it being used to its best ability that it could be? Really well-intended plan, but maybe still not quite meeting the legacy of how the team were kind of thinking about the opportunity that could have been there. And I guess similarly with the Keep Britain Tidy one, it was a bit of a surprise to people. I remember in the room, a bit of a shock. I'm like, oh gosh, of course, that's something that I remember as a child, or I don't really think about now, but actually it's still everywhere. So it's almost become this habit. It's in the environment with us. It was really interesting just exploring the different examples, wasn't it, Karen?
Yeah, it was. And I think that was a really good example, the Keep Britain Tidy, because none of us realised that it was over 50 years old, but how they'd almost reinvented it and kept it very, very fresh, adjusted, adapted, not the core message, not the core vision, but how they went out to different communities and different age groups and adjusted. The other thing that was really interesting about looking at those examples was a tree planting in, I think it was in Kenya, and how small it started and how that was built upon because it had such a really good impact at a really local level, and then it scaled up and scaled up. And projects and initiatives can be like that, but equally it can start at the massive scale like the Olympics, and then trying to scale it back to a more local initiative as a legacy. Those things were all things that we took inspiration from. We were trying to look at the local level, but also the national level and the international level, and how we frame legacy at those different scales, because it's very, very different. What the local community might see as legacy is not what the international legacy might be in terms of climate change initiatives, let's say, feeding into those UN Sustainable Development Goals. They're two very, very different things, but that legacy might come out of one initiative or one project.
You're saying that very small projects can have like quite a big lasting legacy. So the Kenyan tree planting example you gave, you said started very small and then grew. Where do you think legacy belongs in planning? Like, at what stage should you be thinking about the legacy of a project?
You really need to build it in right at the start. And I think things like the Olympics, they did try to think about that. I'm not saying the Olympics did, but it can get quite lost as you focus down on deliverables. We really started thinking about it out of the 6 years of Project Groundwater. We started thinking about it about 2.5 years from the end, which probably felt about right and gives you enough time to really think through what that is. But I think at maybe the different scales, you might have to think about how you introduce that, because for some of those scales, say the local scale, they're just forming their groups and what they're going to do, and to start speaking to them about what happens at the end of the project may be too early. So I don't think it's early, any time is early enough. I always go with projects on the principle of cradle to grave, and the bit after the project's finished to whenever, it can run for another 100 years or can change into something else. I think you need to plan that in right at the start, even if you've planned it in to be look at it halfway through the project.
I think what I liked about Project Groundwater was it wasn't necessarily we did the planning or, Karen suggested we really started kind of focusing on legacy 2.5 years before the end, but our vision really enabled it. It wasn't just to make an impact at a local level. It was to change how groundwater is viewed across a bigger scale. So it almost enabled it right from the beginning for us to not constrain our thinking, but also focusing locally was the place we're going to get the most traction, I guess. Anyone who's starting out on this, it would be make sure your vision enables you to think legacy, but then, starting at the right time for you and whenever that feels right is probably the best advice.
So you don't think it's something that needs to be within the initial bid? So if you're bidding for a project, you don't think you need to outline what you aspire, or do you think there's always legacy built in even if it's not labelled as such? Because you said about the vision. Did that come all the way back to the very first bid for Project Groundwater, or actually was that something that came out after the bid had been approved? Because obviously funding systems are quite tricky. You have to report on certain things to get it. Does it leave room for legacy, or is that something that has to come in later?
I think one of the attractive things about the project and the Flood and Coastal Innovation Programme projects was that they were much longer than the usual couple of years, 3 years. So I always think it's really good practice to think about monitoring, evaluation, which then can lead into legacy. On many projects, those are the things that get cut because you always squeezed for delivering assets or whatever the deliverables are at the end of the project. So I don't remember that we deliberately thought about legacy. I think we were encouraged to think about evaluation as part of the project. I don't know if it was in the minds of the funders what came next. Probably they did start to think about that quite early on in the whole programme, what was going to come after this. I think it is, you're right, difficult then to convince funders when you're in those early stages to really think about something that's going to be a generational change, really. And we, in our legacy vision, well, in the mission really, is that we want to be a catalyst for change. So this is going to be the catalyst and where this goes on to, but it's sowing those seeds with communities. And it may be that other people pick things up and different aspects of the project and move that forward. And that will be a fantastic legacy of the Project Groundwater if that is traced back to that's where it started. I don't think it has to stay the same and probably shouldn't stay the same, but actually adapt and morph into something different.
Yeah, I guess that's the thing, isn't it? With it being an innovation project as well, is there some unknowns? We're testing it. And I guess the real bonus is that we are able to have these discussions now. So it shows that actually the work that's being done is having impact, and there's evidence to say this thing has got a legacy opportunity for it. Hence why the conversations are being had now. And I guess just making a build on Karen's point on this doesn't necessarily have to stay with the Project Groundwater kind of current governance structure and payment structure and the funding governance that's around it. The hope is that the activities will find their rightly home and that people will take ownership for these things. What that looks like obviously needs some work, and there's still funding challenges with that and resourcing challenges, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a continuation of a governed project that's funded from one source. And I guess that's what's exciting about the legacy, is how you design that to make it work in real life, I guess.
That forward planning that you're saying, I guess we can use Project Groundwater as an example, but how do we use legacy planning to strategize for what will happen on project end? Because obviously when funding does end, suddenly there'll be a loss of 36 partners working on Project Groundwater, all delivering in this space, to all of them being out of contract. The Project Groundwater team within Bucks Council doesn't necessarily exist anymore. So how would we go about planning sort of for legacy and for ensuring that certain things are continuing?
I think it's a challenge, but I think it's about building momentum at different levels. One of the things that Project Groundwater has done really well is reach out to the wider flood community, raise the profile of groundwater flooding. That has been excellent, and it's certainly got more attention, certainly at Flood and Coast. There was more talk about groundwater. I think we've still got a long way to go. I think by building momentum as well, by joining into a network with the two other groundwater projects, I think we identified that quite early on. And the projects are quite different, but I think we have a good understanding, some common themes. We're working on certain things together, such as the mental health aspect of this, because we see it's actually better to be joined together and share resources. And some of those themes are very common themes, even though quite different mechanisms, but it's all building that momentum and raising the profile of groundwater flooding. Also, the momentum with those people who will have influence after the end of the project. So the Environment Agency, finding the right people to discuss what we've done and how that gets taken forward, at a national level. On the planning side, getting into the planning policy with the right people. And I think going back to this being a long-term project, 6 years, it takes time to do that and takes quite a lot of effort, but people have had that time and the resources to do that, which is great. And then with the local authorities, we've had a lot of local authority interaction from our partners there and on the board. So hopefully they will have more understanding and be able to pick some of these things up. Building the momentum with the communities is perhaps more challenging because they don't have an obvious role in the governance. They do have a role, but it's not really funded and it's reliant on volunteers. And that means that those people can disappear, move house, move area, or just go off and do something else. And it's challenging to keep that going.
Yeah, I was going to talk about kind of advocacy. And we joke that once you've joined Project Groundwater, you never really leave. So it's almost kind of like we've got 38 partners who are always going to be friends of Project Groundwater. So how do we harness that? How do we, when we're not in a room together, how do we advocate for the topic in all the other bits of work that we end up all doing? We've got evidence as well, haven't we, in the communities that some communities are more able to take ownership for things. So we've seen community groups pop up, for example, where they do want to do that themselves, but other communities really struggle with that for lots of different reasons. So I guess from a legacy point of view, it's also thinking about not one size fits all, especially at a community level. And then I think the other thing, just to re-emphasize that Karen said, is around the policy. So how do we make sure we deliver or we enable tailored approaches for communities for them to continue owning efforts, but also how do we influence policy? If the policy doesn't change, people aren't going to be able to act differently, because that's what drives a lot of decision making in organisations. Using the network that Karen's described, how do we place ourselves in those discussions with the evidence base that we've got from the project to kind of influence the topic at a national level? There's lots of prongs to how you enable legacy, and it's quite a complex kind of web that needs some kind of orchestrating almost.
Yeah, and I think advocate actually is a really good word, because as Karen was speaking, I was thinking like all these things sort of connect together in the building connections with key stakeholders to also like people of influence, but actually it is in all ways like creating advocates for the project will have a lasting influence, because like you said, so many partners all working within the flood risk industry, and if they all become like key advocates just for groundwater like flooding to be considered in general, then as you said, that in itself will have like that will create waves within the industry, more people talking about it, that going in. The policy, again, like we need advocates for that as well, because policy often only changes when there's like obvious want and need for it. Like you need to make it very clear, like we've seen in flood risk before, the policy changed post flooding. That's the key, but we don't want people to have to flood in order to get change. So that's a very interesting like perspective to come from, is like we're trying to avoid the need for a flood to create change, which is difficult. And with groundwater flooding only happening every 10 plus years,
that is a real challenge, and people forget that flooding memory, and people don't understand what is happening, so think it's coming from a river or from surface water. The other thing within this is having some tools that people can actually access that helps them. So I know you've spoken on the podcast about the flood warning system, where we're wanting to make sure that keeps going and develops, so that it could develop across different areas. So, and then that there's more chance of it getting funding. It's building that momentum in terms of those tools and making sure we leave tools for the professionals, because the professionals as well as the communities, there aren't necessarily that many people, because groundwater flooding is not as prevalent as river flooding. So perhaps less people come out of university and do research and go into that. We need to keep that knowledge base and that understanding really high within the professionals, so they understand what is happening when the groundwater flooding does occur, and also toolkits for what people can do for their own house, within their own community, but also understanding from a professional point of view what we could do at a catchment scale. So there's lots of different layers of this in terms of making sure that the understanding and the work carries on, but it's always going to be reliant on some funding and some people taking this forward within the practitioner community of those risk management authorities.
Yeah, I think the interesting angle is going to be the innovation side of it. So how do we continue to innovate with some of those challenges? So councils, for example, we know they're all stretched. If we add to the policy where they've got bigger responsibility to build groundwater flooding considerations into their planning processes, well, is that going to mean that they're going to need more resource? How do we innovate on that to make sure that the right people are doing it, but it's not constraining the system any more than it already is? The innovation angle is going to be really interesting on how all of the Project Groundwater projects leave their legacy. And I guess it does come back to, I want to call them kind of custodians. So who are the custodians of this going forward? Is that one organisation? Is it a group of organisations, a group of individuals? And I know we've talked about the Let's Talk network, Karen, and what the opportunity is with that network going forward, and kind of having that anchor point, I guess, where things can act as a conduit for the topic.
And do you mind just touching on what Let's Talk is? I don't believe it's been spoken about before on the podcast.
There are 3 Project Groundwaters within the Flood and Coastal Innovation Projects, and we all formed a network, and we communicate with one another about what we do and share ideas, share some resources on some aspects of our projects. And we began to think about legacy and, well, what comes next? And the idea originally was around professionals getting together and having a point where we can share information and people could come to that, and there'd be documents, there'd be some toolkits where people could learn more about groundwater flooding, and there might be some access into people who were experts that people could speak to. We then thought actually it would be maybe a good idea where communities could come and feed their really valuable information in a citizen science way, also have access to professionals to ask questions and have those answered, and the professionals and the practitioners could understand where the issues were, and people could say, actually, I'm experiencing groundwater flooding, or is this groundwater flooding? So you begin to build up a catalogue, a database of information from those communities, which could be really valuable. And also a landing page, but also a space where people can be pointed to other information. So we're calling it now a community of practice, and we're just beginning to expand on our ideas and develop our ideas around that and go out to those different parts of the whole community of groundwater flooding, communities and the general public and professionals and academics and researchers and those working in risk management authorities, and say, what would you like to see? Is this useful? We've had feedback that people think it would be useful, but exactly what it looks like and how that gets delivered and what sort of content, I think, is still to be arranged, and we will continue to work on it throughout the remaining 20 months now of this project. And so our idea is that then becomes a legacy and a place where we can put things and people can come, but that also will need some funding, so we're exploring those ideas as well. So I think it's really exciting. We have lots of information and legacy already. I mean, the Darcy Ardman film is a really good example of that, but also more technical content and the flood warning app. But I think if it can be a landing space, and it's probably going to be web-based, where people can come and get information, but also share information and discuss ideas, that would be fantastic and very exciting.
Full name of that one is Let's Talk Groundwater Flooding.
Yes.
I will link in the episode notes to the website so people can go check it out, find out more about that. That's a very clear piece of legacy, isn't it? If we knew that there needed to be a space for this, and there wasn't one, so we have created one. Did that come from legacy work, or did legacy just start feeding into it? What way round did it go?
Interesting question. There's a few things happening in parallel, I think, Karen, wasn't there? The Let's Talk network started before we discussed legacy in any great detail, didn't it?
Yeah, I think it happened more kind of organically. I mean, the network was set up between the 3 projects, and we all decided to call ourselves Project Groundwater and had a memorandum of understanding, whereas before we weren't named that. We started thinking, okay, well, could this turn into something beyond the project? And I think then that probably then drove us to think, actually, we need to perhaps be thinking a little bit more systematically about what legacy is and defining that for each of the individual work streams and making sure we capture these deliverables are going to be legacy. So actually these things that we've said we're going to do, that we are going to deliver those, and those become legacy. But actually, there may be some things that are extra and additional to the project that we'd like to do, both in the short term after the project, but wider as well. And hopefully that can then inform the whole debate around groundwater, that we've left what our views are as to what needs to happen on a bigger scale, on a national scale, and international scale, because we have had some interest internationally. There are other parts of the world that struggle with groundwater flooding. It's not just here in England. So I think if we can leave that base and leave some of our thinking, of course it will change and develop and evolve. That's a good thing, but I think it needs to come from a base. So I think that's how it developed.
You just reminded me, Karen, actually, about the way that we then looked at each of the work streams, and there are some additional legacy points that we hope will leave as well around all the programme governance and the contractual side of how to run a 38 partnership innovation project, or the workshop collateral that we've created in how to stimulate innovation and what kind of resources to use. And we've captured all of that stuff as well. So from a professional point of view, if someone were to develop a project similar to Project Groundwater in the future, there's ways for them to do that successfully and learn from the things that we've done as well on Project Groundwater. So again, it's multifaceted legacy, bringing lots of different benefits for different people.
Yes, it reminded me of one thing that you said early on, Kat, about these innovation projects, that because it's an innovation project, and one of the attractive things about it is that we are allowed to and encouraged to try new things and try new ways of working and different ways of working with communities. And we're capturing all of that learning, but it's okay for something to not go well, and we capture that and we capture the reasons. And I think often those things are swept away and don't talk about that because it didn't work. But actually that is often where you get the most learning, when something failed or didn't work as you thought it was going to do. You reflect on that and say, well, why didn't it work? And there's a lot more learning from that you can take into the next project. So I think we're quite keen to do that and to be really honest about, we've tried some of these things and it didn't go well. Some of the modelling techniques that we tried, they didn't really work. And we went out to the wider technical community and said, are we on the right track? And, you know, we had a very honest discussion, and that has been really helpful. Some of the ways that we've tried to interact with communities, for some communities, hasn't been the right thing. I think just in that spirit of really trying to learn, sometimes have to go backwards in order to take a step forwards, because you realise you've gone down the wrong path, or you've taken a path that wasn't the best one available. That, in terms of a legacy, it sounds a bit of a strange thing to say, doesn't it? The legacy of where we went wrong.
Legacy of learning.
Yeah. I think we're always really nervous about saying that we failed at something, or culturally it's not a good thing to say that, is it? Or professionally it's not a good thing to say that. But I think we do need to be more honest about it and say, this didn't go well, but this is what we learned. Not just to stop there, but to say this is what we learned and this is how we then went on. And
I guess as a legacy, it's trying to embrace that ongoing, right? Because groundwater is still misunderstood. And even though Project Groundwater has taken leaps and strides in trying to understand that, we're not going to understand it to its completeness in the 5 years that we've got. Well, there'll be something that we didn't come across that someone else will find in another 2 years. So kind of maintaining that curiosity, innovative thinking in trying to solve something that's been misunderstood and is probably not going to be understood completely for quite some time.
I feel like it's very interesting because we've been speaking about legacy almost in inherently positive terms, because we view legacy as something we want to leave positively, but actually legacy itself is a neutral term and not entirely something you can control. Like, you can plan, but ultimately the legacy you leave, it's the positive views, it's the way that people remember you, it's how it continues. And that's why I guess we plan for it, is because if you don't plan, you might leave one anyway, but you just haven't sort of set up a strategy for what you hope that legacy will be.
Exactly. Yeah, and making sure, like Karen said, engaging people before the project ends in what that legacy wants to and needs to look like. You then build a better opportunity for something that works for everyone involved. And you're right, if you let it go organically, you could be really lucky and just have something that's fantastic, or it could be completely the opposite, couldn't it?
It's interesting for us because Project Groundwater is a massive project and it covers so many things. And we said it's very innovative. Groundwater is underexplored from a flooding perspective. So we sit in a place where, whether we planned it or not, we should realistically have some form of legacy. Whereas I guess it's sort of different for like much smaller local projects, because it's that idea of like, say, like a local nature-based solutions project, it only really affects that small part of the catchment. But I would still think that legacy is important in that, I think we've spoken a bit wider about like, it's not just that the flood risk element of that, there should be a wider legacy. And we were very lucky, and we had someone on talking in one of our previous episodes about a nature-based solutions project. It's in Pickering, slowing the flow Pickering. He came on about that, and it started as like, we have flood risk, we need to get rid of it, bring in the beavers. Best thing you could do is say bring in the beavers. And they did, but he talked about that project that he had like supported and worked on with like a local volunteer. Not only in that it had helped with the flood risk, but everyone got so interested, like the beavers got everyone involved. They were learning more about flood risk. They were learning more about personal resilience. And again, they might not necessarily set up that legacy, but they got a project going from a really local scale that really impacted the local community, became like a really good example of introducing beavers and amazing work they can do in flood risk management, which then became like the slowing the flow idea really picked up and ran with them. And that was, I think, an example of small scale project, big legacy.
Makes me think about the impact on people who are not in the community as well. So I visited a different park this weekend with my kids. It was in North Leeds, where I don't reside. And we came across a small community garden that was in the middle of this public park. And they were planting vegetables, and it was just a wonderful moment. My children love our allotment. They were kind of looking at what the plants were and like, oh, Mummy, can we plant this one ours? And the impact that it had for someone who isn't in their community was probably just unexpected. I don't even know if they planned that would happen. And it makes me think about those nature-based solutions that are in the communities in and around books, but maybe people who are walking, who come and explore the area around you guys. It's something that you maybe don't plan for people visiting, but they then take it back to their community and say, oh my God, I saw this amazing solution. How about that working for us? It's thinking about that kind of transient population as well, I guess, and the impact it can have more widely than just the people who reside in that area.
And I think communication is so important in that, and the widest communication possible, because I think through social media you can do so much, and people can experience that, can't they, as well as experiencing it in person. But I think with, say, the nature-based solutions, I think it will be so important to have some sort of explanation board about what this is doing for those people who come across it just walking along or visiting the area, or planters, what is this planter doing? So I think then that goes back to the advocacy, doesn't it? Those individual householders can be advocates for the pumps and the resilience measures that are on their house. The communities can be advocates, but you do need lots of different ways of being advocates, and through social media. Obviously, we've got Darcy. I know that Lincolnshire have done a book off the back of Darcy, so that then becomes a legacy through to educational resources. And I think Project Groundwater was quite insightful in identifying that we needed a dedicated comms lead, and that actually the people on the project didn't have those skills, and bringing those skills in. And I think that has reaped a lot of benefit. That is a really good legacy, is that actually, if you want to leave a legacy, you have to think about that right at the beginning. And it's often one of the things that gets cut because there's not enough money. And well, let's do the technical stuff, which is great. But then if the technical stuff isn't explained and maintained, so it's thinking about that real long-term impact of what you're doing, and communication is right at the heart of that.
The way that Project Groundwater set itself up in the beginning with the core team, I think is definitely something that others can learn from as well. Mixture of expertise, communications expertise, project governance expertise has just enabled that to work really well. I think that's definitely something people can learn from as a legacy as well.
Linking back in again with that idea of failure, is that if you are planning for it, you can control the narrative. Seems like a bad thing, but what we mean is that you want people to not see failure but see learning. But if you don't create the tools for that, like if you don't have information people can go and be like, oh well, I can learn from that, then it is just a failure. Unless you're building in and you're like helping with the narrative of this doesn't work isn't it fantastic that we know this now and this is where it could go next?
Yeah.
But without considering how to get that out there, it just becomes this project tried something and that didn't work. And that will be your legacy.
I think on that narrative point, it's been clear that, Project Groundwater is one type of project, but that doesn't mean you can't learn and transfer that learning to something else that other people are trying to do. So, the modelling is a very technical, specific part of the Project Groundwater scope. But there will be things in there about how the different technical experts collaborated to solve that problem when things weren't going to plan. Is definitely that's completely transferable to other sectors and industries and organisations. So I think something that we might want to think about is how we help people translate those learnings into legacy as well.
Mad question, but do you ever think there's too much? Is there ever a point where you reach where you're in such a big project and you're doing so much that you sort of need to, from like a legacy perspective, pick some things to focus on? Because if you try to create a legacy out of everything you've done, will that work? Or is there not too much and actually you can plan in for everything if you do it soon enough?
It's a great question.
It is a really good question. For me, it's around getting everybody thinking about legacy and not just one person. What Kat and I have been doing is trying to get everybody interested and get into that mindset of thinking about legacy, because what the legacy is for those people doing MBS or the modelling part will be very different. And Kat and I might not interpret that correctly and what the legacy is for the community. So it's actually bringing this idea of legacy in and allowing people to think through that and share that out rather than bringing it into, this is another work stream and this is just our idea of how it should look. So I think broadening it out, it's more difficult to keep track of, but the tentacles of it will spread far and wide then.
We did do some prioritization, didn't we? Because there was things that people were already doing that maybe they weren't thinking as a legacy. So we helped them just take some time, I guess, to just take in what we were thinking about from a legacy point of view and apply it to their work streams. There were some additional thoughts that aren't included in anywhere in the project at the moment. And I guess then there's a decision to say, do we want to do those things? Are they high enough priority? Are they going to make the impact we really want to have? And if so, how do we fight their corner with the funding? So it's not just make a massive long list and try and get it all done. It's finding that sweet spot with the work streams, but also has to be some prioritization if the list is too long.
Is there anything that you think we've missed? Is there anything you think, when it comes to legacy, we couldn't possibly wrap up this conversation without talking about X?
The one thing I found really interesting was when we did the vision, mission, values piece, Karen. So we looked at the vision, mission and values from Project Groundwater from a legacy perspective. And initially it was kind of thought as, I guess, a kind of reset in the project to say, right, we now need to pivot to start thinking about a legacy perspective. And as we started to explore that a bit further, it almost became as like it's just an evolution, isn't it? So what it demonstrated was the vision at the beginning really enabled it to begin with, but it also enabled us to kind of just expand it slightly. So it wasn't a reset. We didn't have to redo everything. It was more, we now know differently what we knew at the beginning, and we've been able to just evolve how we interpret the vision and mission that we initially set out. So that was something I think took a bit of getting head round for people on the project as well, that it was this kind of evolution. I think it was Dave Cobby actually who said it in the workshop to say, actually, this is really similar. Actually, can we just frame this as an evolution rather than kind of a reset? And it was just that real pivotal moment in kind of people's framing, I guess.
Yeah, you're right. And if you look at the vision, mission and values for legacy, they're very, very similar to the core project. But I think it's seeing that actually the project is kind of a caretaker of this work. Some people will stay with it and develop it in different ways, and that might depend on where we're able to get funding, that list of things that we had that we prioritized. And somebody might catch the vision for it, or we might be able to apply for more funding for a particular area, and other people will take it on, take it to the next level and evolve it. And other people, the work that they did in Project Groundwater will stand and they'll drop away and do different things. So I think that sense of being a caretaker for something and passing it on to the next stage for me is really key with that vision, mission and values. And I think the values was so key in terms of how we work with one another, and the trust and the transparency, the openness that we have, that hopefully that will be a thread through work going forward.
So do you feel like having something set there that really then helped you evolve that into legacy? Is that something that projects can do? They don't need to start on legacy on day one, but having a very clear vision would support it later down the road.
Yeah, I'd say a vision that enables legacy, so not too constrained. That's great with how Jed's talked about and set up and led this project, isn't it? He's always thought big, which is really enabled, and the vision enabled that in the first instance. So yeah.
So Karen and Kat, thank you so much for joining me today. If anybody wants to hear more about Slow the Flow Pickering story, which was shared with us by Mike, who's a volunteer, that was episode 13, Policy, How to Move the Needle. Thank you for listening to Groundwater Rising. Please hit the subscribe button on your podcast provider, leave us a review, and tell your friends and colleagues about us. Do you have a topic you'd like us to focus on Groundwater Rising, or would you like to join me to share your personal groundwater flood story? Please email me on groundwaterrising@projectgroundwater.co.uk. That's all for now. We will be back on the last Thursday of next month with another episode of Groundwater Rising.